Well, cool. So you already know our names. And so Eric and I are the owners and operators of Advanced Property Management. We manage both single family rental properties as well as multifamily. Um, my background is that I've been in property management for about 15 years. Started in Chicago, managing just high-rise condo associations. Um, Moved to Denver in 2015, ran a large multifamily division for a company in Denver. And then about 3 years ago, Eric and I teamed up and we acquired Advanced Property Management, which was a well-established company at that time. The founder who started the business in the early 90s was ready to retire. Eric and I were fortunate enough to be able to acquire the company. And really since then, it's just been us trying to refine our processes, obviously continue growing. And so, yeah, 3 years later, in fact, tomorrow is our 3-year anniversary. I've only got the business, so that's exciting.
Yeah.
But again, tonight, thank you. The goal of this again is just to equip all of you with some best practices that we employ in our business, but that certainly that you could use as you self-manage your own properties. And we're always there for you as a resource. As soon as you find one day you just have a question, or you want to get to a point where you just don't have time and you want to have your property professionally managed, again, we'd love to be a resource for you. Okay. So with that, let's dive into the slides. Eric, anything to add before we do?
No, our unit count, did you give?
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
Yes, we manage almost about 500 units now with recent acquisition. So we're getting a pretty big footprint across Denver area. We're probably as far north as I'd say Erie, and we now have a property in Colorado Springs. So we're slowly starting to spread our tentacles, I guess, so to speak. So
tentacles, ew. So it sounds like from the introduction, some of you are already self-managing. Some of you are kind of getting ready to get into the game. Super awesome. Anything you can do, obviously, to begin to build your portfolios. And Amy and others would attest. It's fantastic. I'm in the process of finally getting my first investment property. As Eric mentioned, we're going to go in on one together, which we're excited about. But we also fee manage, right? And so we have a lot of clients whose properties we manage, both single and multifamily. And so over the last few years, and certainly prior for me, having been in the industry a long time, we've just learned, ways to do things that we feel are best, right? And so, as I said, tonight we're going to dive into some best practices. Before we do, let's apply some context to the frame of mind that you should have as you dive into self-managing. And this applies, I'm assuming, to every business. You hear it a lot in ours, but that's it right there, which is you got to detach from the sentimental value that you may have for your property, right, to manage it well. Do not inject emotion into the decisions you make that are in the best interest of your investment. So with that being the case, let's start with the first topic. And so the way we've put this particular discussion together tonight is just really the high points as it relates to property management. Okay, and we'll kind of dive into each to a certain degree. And again, happy to answer any questions you may have, either during the slide or afterwards. Feel free to just spit them out, not a problem at all. So you've got your property, you're ready to find your first tenant, okay? You have a whole lot to do ahead of you, right, to make sure that that relationship, that experience for both you and the tenant gets off on the right foot, okay? And so we're going to go through sort of the different steps to the tenant acquisition process now. First and foremost is getting the property ready, okay? Maybe you've done the work yourself, maybe you've got a maintenance company you've hired, etc. Property is ready to go. You're going to dive into getting some great marketing photos, because that makes a huge amount of difference in this market, right? Having professional photos. First rule of thumb, do not take marketing photos yourself on your cell phone, and unless you're a professional photographer, don't attempt to even use that type of equipment, right? There's a lot of great companies out there for very inexpensively will take really fantastic marketing photos for you. So, for the first year, Eric and I did our own photos for the business, right? Had the nice camera, flash, all the stuff, had the photo editing software. And after about the first year, a friend turned us on to another company, which we now use, a professional photography company. we started doing the math on the amount of time it took us to get to the property, take the photos, go back to the office, plug them through your photo editing software, and finally get them up online. And it was probably 3 or 4 hours total, right?
And
So
they're
we
about
started doing the math
half
like,
as good as.
yeah, and of course, yeah, they were super inferior to what actual marketing photos should be. So very quickly, we realized this just isn't worth our time. And you're going to find that a lot as you kind of self-manage. There's certain things you may want to do. There's other things you're probably better off just contracting out. So a couple years ago, we started just contracting out all of our marketing photos. It's worked out really well. And again, that makes a huge amount of difference in this market for sure. So photos versus video, you can see up there. Anecdotally, there's a lot of information to indicate that video really isn't great when you're trying to lease a property. It almost shows the prospective tenant too much, right? And it allows them to be in a position where they can make a decision before they even see the property because they feel like they've toured it, right, with videos. We don't do videos for our properties. We just have a batch of really nice photos. We want to get that prospect on the phone. We want to pre-screen them. We want to get a showing scheduled, right? We want to get them to the property. We can get a better sense for who they are. And ultimately, if we feel like they'd be a good fit, sell them on the property in person, okay? Some people may feel like video prevents you from being able to take those steps. So take that for what it is. Obviously, the description of the property, stick to the facts, the basics. It doesn't need to be flowery. It doesn't need to talk about how amazing your olives are going to taste on the balcony at sunset, on the such and such a day. Just stick to the facts of the property, the highlighted points, etc. Platforms, for us, we build our marketing and our property management system that's then syndicates across a whole swath of websites. Zillow for us, of course, is the primary driver of our prospective tenants right now. And so, most, I believe, self-managers probably build their marketing via Zillow. And again, that will still syndicate across other websites. Initial screening. So you're at the point where you've launched your marketing, you've got great photos, and you're starting to get inquiries from interested tenants. First and foremost, you want to have some kind of basic disqualifier questions, okay, at the outset to make sure that you're not wasting your time showing somebody a property who may or may not qualify, okay? So basics such as, eviction history, felonies, general credit questions. You can think of a handful of those, right? Put a good set of questions together to make sure that they pass all of those before you get to a point where you're going to schedule an in-person showing with them, all right? Once you get through that pre-screening and you feel like they could still be a good fit, you're going to move to scheduling the in-person showing. You're going to meet them at the property. As I said, get a better sense for who they are. Should you feel like they could be a good fit after that showing and they express interest, maybe you encourage them to apply. If they do, you're going to jump into the background check. Super critical step in the process. There's a lot of tools on the market for self-managers to run a background check, okay? With that, you're gonna do a deep dive into credit, criminal, rental, employment history, kind of those 4 big buckets. All right, see how that comes back. Hopefully there's no...
What are the top ones right now? I mean, doesn't Zillow have one right on there?
For self-managers, Zillow is going to be probably the best,
Yep.
to be honest with you.
Yeah, and so we use one called Find Digs, which is more designed for property management companies. It's rides on the back of TransUnion, which a lot of them do when it comes to the background checks. But yeah, there's a whole variety. Zillow is probably the best, to Eric's point. So those 4 big buckets, hopefully there's no red flags that arise, right, with that background check. But nonetheless, regardless of if there is or not, you're going to do a few things. You're going to collect proof of income. Okay, so if the tenant tells you to make a certain amount of money via their application, you want to verify that they actually do. Hey, provide me some pay stubs. If you're self-employed, bank statement, that type of stuff. Criminal is self-explanatory. Want to verify employment. Okay, they're going to provide you that information on their application. You're going to review their credit. And then lastly, if they are an existing renter or previous renter, you want to do a rental verification for them. Talk to their existing or prior landlord. Ask some of the big questions, right? Were they a great tenant? Did they pay rent on time? Take care of the property? Were they a good neighbor? Those types of things. Super important. And so, is that me bumping this? I'm sorry. All right. It could be. I'll stand right here. Assuming all that comes back positive, you're like, man, this tenant's fantastic. They pass all of our tests. I'm ready to get them to sign a lease. You want to make sure you're using a lease that has sufficient protections for you as the landlord, okay? So you can get a lot of different leases online. my recommendation would be is that you probably talk to a real estate attorney and get a really good, robust lease that you can use for your tenants. Again, that has the protections in it for you, such as the lease break provision, right? Um, Earlier on in the business, the lease we inherited with the acquisition of Advanced Property Management did not have one of those lease break provisions, right? When a tenant's like, hey, I'm getting a job out of state, I got to move tomorrow. Well, but your lease doesn't expire for 5 months, right? I'm not in a position, it could be November, it could be a week before Thanksgiving. As the owner of the property or the manager, we're not in a position to find a new tenant right now. In fact, it's a really bad time of year to do so. So this isn't great for anybody. But the bottom line is that lease didn't protect us from being able to tell them that they couldn't leave. That was really problematic, right? Because then what are you doing? You got turnover cost, the tenant leaves, you got vacancy loss, you're not collecting any rental revenue. Then you get the expense of trying to find a new tenant, not to mention your time. So our lease now, right, has, of course, a reletting fee provision. If a tenant says, hey, I got to leave tomorrow, well, they're going to be paying the owner of the property, not us, but the owner of the property, an amount equal to 2 months' rent. Okay, and that's liquidated damages, right? So that's an amount that's meant to cover the landlord for all of the costs incurred to find a new tenant. Okay, so that's a big one. A couple other ones. I'll just spit these out here really quick. So, maintenance responsibility is one that we come across often. We manage, as I said, a lot of single-family homes, which of course come with yards and irrigation systems and all that type of stuff. And understanding the delineation of responsibility between you as the landlord and the tenant is critically important to ensure that that exterior landscaping remains well cared for. Because even if a short amount of time passes and somebody's not doing what they're supposed to, it could cost a lot of money to get that landscaping back up to snuff again, right? So who's handling irrigation? Okay, who's handling the lawn mowing, weed mitigation, all those types of things. So for us, right, we handle irrigation because those systems often are too sophisticated for most tenants to want to deal with or understand how to deal with. So we have a crew that does all of our startups, repairs, and winterizations for irrigation, and that's part of our lease. Okay, that's clearly defined. Tenant's responsibility in our world is, hey, you got to mow the yard, you got to mitigate any weeds, whether you're hand pulling or spraying those, and we'd like you to try to fertilize at least once a year. Okay, and so tenants, via signing our lease, agree to do all of that, and ultimately via our, inspections, which we'll get to down the road, we're going to hold them accountable, right, to their obligations in that lease. Yep. So if we were to go buy a property, let's say, and the lawn is completely out of control, right, it would start with, of course, with a phone call, understanding why that's the case, understanding whether they know or remember, rather, that it's their responsibility to care for it. But should that not get cured in a short amount of time, you can post what's called a legal demand for compliance, okay, which is no different than a legal demand for rent if a tenant's not paying you rent. Okay, this one's compliance. They have to then cure that fault. 10, yep, 10 days. Yep. So our lease calls out exactly what they're responsible for, right? And they acknowledge that when they sign it. And that's just one of course, many provisions within the lease itself that, like furnace filter changes is another one. They need to change their own furnace filter, okay, quarterly. And so, again, we're able to hold them accountable to that since that is a legal document, that lease.
And be
They have to initial each one. If they log the disposal, they have to pay.
Mhm.
They can't even put, they have to drill thin nails in the wall. They have to pay. So you can put whatever you want. You just have to, it's clear that they know their responsibility and what the code requires.
And I think that's the biggest point is like be crystal clear. In our lease, as far as the like, it needs to be mowed to 4 inches high, like that specific. No interpretations, black and white, and then also make sure they understand it. So back to Amy's point, because on the front end, as long as you're open about everything, it's a non-event when it comes to holding them accountable.
Yeah, and really spelling out, along those lines, like utilities is another great example. Specifically, what utilities they're responsible for paying, providing in the contact information and name of that utility provider, and so that's captured in the lease. So there's no question down the road.
The other thing I will say is that they're especially in Colorado here, they'll come out mid-year with new laws, laws of certain things you have to have in your lease. So if you are, I would highly recommend that you get a real estate attorney to review your lease. Don't just use one of these online. You may not know the changing Colorado laws, and then make sure that you're keeping current on that.
Mhm.
There's specific things that came out this last year that people had to rewrite leases and things like that.
Our lease is at our attorney right now getting reviewed and updated because, yeah, there's a lot of new legislation coming down the pipe for landlords right now. And actually, there's a whole slide on that we'll get to. All right, so let's say your lease is signed, your tenant's locked in, right, legally, because they've signed the lease, you've countersigned it. You're at the point now where you're collecting the security deposit, okay? We recommend at least an amount equal to 1 month's rent. We have found that that is not a barrier to leasing. A lot of companies charge much less than that. But for us, we do ask for a security deposit equal to 1 month's rent. We feel that's super fair. It further protects the landlord, right? Should that tenant leave and cause damage in the property. If they cause damage beyond the amount of security deposit, yes, you can bill them legally for any additional damage repair. But again, once you've got that security deposit, you're ready to move to getting that house ready for move-in, right? The pre-move-in. So you got the house ready for the market. Maybe nothing's changed. Maybe you don't have to do anything else. But you really want to emphasize the importance of getting that house ready for move-in because that's really what's going to dictate the whole experience your tenant has in the relationship that they have with you as the landlord, right? We've seen it countless times, certainly earlier on in the business and previously, that a tenant moves in and they identify that the fridge wasn't cleaned or that wasn't fixed. Suddenly they feel like you're just a neglectful landlord, right? So you really want to make sure that property is completely tuned up before you meet a tenant there to move them in. It's going to make everybody's life a lot easier, especially yours, trust me. Otherwise, you're going to start getting work orders left and right.
Does anybody here do something where the landlord or property manager is responsible for like the furnace filter as like give notice and as a way to kind of see conditions?
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's a great idea.
Yep. Some companies do that. I'm sure a lot of self-managers do that as well for the purpose you just described, which is give them a chance to get in the house, do a bit of an inspection.
Well,
for sure.
Also, seeing people lately putting in the lease a professional house cleaning, like once a month or something, as another way to check on it and keep it up.
Okay, so we're heading towards move-in day. You collected the security deposit. You also want to make sure your tenant has renter's insurance. Super important, because if there is some type of loss at that house, there should be no question as to who's responsible for what. Okay, especially as it relates to their personal belongings, which is what their renter's insurance would cover, along with liability, right, should they cause the loss. And so we always collect proof of renter's insurance for all of our tenants before we move them in, and we need to be listed as an additional insured, interested party, so then we're getting updates on whether that policy is renewed or canceled, okay? Really important. We also like to collect, which we suggest for you as well, the utility account numbers, making sure that they've actually put those utilities in their name, okay? Hold those account numbers on file during the duration of their tenancy. So you've done all that. You meet the tenant for move-in. On move-in day, you want to do a bit of an orientation with them of the house, right? Here's where the furnace is. Here's how you change the air filter. Here's where the main water shutoff is. If there is any type of significant leak, right, before you call us, kill that valve. Okay, stop the water, give us a call immediately thereafter. That type of stuff, making sure they know a bit about the infrastructure of the house, okay? Beyond that, you're out and you've got yourself a new tenant. Okay, you're ready to collect rent. So that's the tenant acquisition process in a nutshell. Any questions? Fantastic.
I'm a little curious of how you know if they've changed the filter and then also fertilized.
Yeah, and so in part it's well, fertilization would be the honor system. We do not demand a receipt. So, for us, right, managing a larger business, we want to be careful about not creating processes that are going to lead to a lot more work for us because the cost benefit may not be there, right? But for you, as the self-manager, absolutely. You could say, hey, here's the requirement within the lease. I want you to send me the receipt or whatever, right, after you fertilize. More importantly, on the furnace filter side, what we do is, because we can't go around hundreds of properties to make sure they've changed them, which is, hey, if there's an issue with the HVAC system at that property, the first thing our vendor is going to check is that filter, right? And if we find that it hasn't been changed, which they'll know pretty quick, then that cost might be pinned back on you as the tenant. Okay. So the accountability is a bit loose, in part by design, but certainly as a self-manager with one or a few properties, you could tighten that up.
And don't hesitate. Like if you're interested in that, by all means, like, hey, I fertilize, I change furnace filters. It's just a great excuse to get out to the property.
Okay, yeah, right.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're.
yeah, exactly. Charge for that.
Yep.
All right, this is just a really quick one, but it is important that as a landlord, you have the right insurance coverage, okay? So when you convert a property to a rental or you acquire a rental property, make sure you talk to your homeowner's insurance and get a landlord rider on your policy, okay? So they know that it's a rental property, okay? There'll be some liability insurance that comes along with that, but that's a thing you'll absolutely need. Secondly, if your property resides within a homeowners association, okay, you want to look at what's called the HO6 or HCA06 loss assessment coverage, which is in the case of a significant loss that impacts the entire homeowners association, right? They're going to file a claim, okay, which your assessments would cover as a member of the HOA. However, the deductible for that claim will be charged back to all of the members of that HOA. Okay, so say you've got a condo in a giant condo association and they have to re-roof everything because there was a significant hailstorm that comes by. They'll submit a claim, but they could have a $50,000 deductible, right? The HOA. They're going to spread that $50,000 deductible across all the members of that HOA. If you have loss assessment coverage, it will more than likely cover your portion of that deductible that the HOA is assessing you. Okay.
And we're talking your special assessment could be $5,000 and the HO6 policy is like $15 a year. So
Very
it's
inexpensive.
worth it.
Yes.
Yep. It's not going to there's certain special assessment things it won't cover. Like if they want to redo the entrance monument, that doesn't count. That kind of stuff. It's like true loss. Yep.
Cool. So let's move on to property maintenance, right? Because you've got a tenant, they're loving living in your house, they're paying rent on time, but work orders are periodically arising that you're having to address, whether you address them yourself or you're contracting some type of handyman service to potentially do so. So let's just kind of go through some of the best practices and information related to property maintenance. So first and foremost, it's a good idea to budget for maintenance, right? So as part of your analysis when it comes to your investment property, you want to account for setting some of that rental revenue aside into just a reserve account, okay? We recommend roughly 10% a month of rent collected, just put it in a reserve account. You never know when something small is going to arise that you utilize those funds for, or down the road, maybe you need a new water heater or furnace, right? But as long as you're funding that account on a monthly basis, you should be okay, all right? Because things will arise. That's the biggest aha I think we see with new investors is that they buy a property, they start collecting rent, and then maintenance issues start arising. They're like, oh my, like this is killing my cash flow. What's happening? I didn't expect this. And some of it could be that they just didn't ask the right questions on the front end, right? What are the age of the mechanicals? All those types of things. But they also didn't really plan for expenses, right? Despite maybe everybody's best guidance. And so again, always plan for maintenance. If you can put 10% a month of rent collected away, you should be in good shape, generally to cover anything that arises at the property. You also want to consider the difference between preventive/seasonal maintenance, like seasonal services on the HVAC system, clearing your gutters, vacuuming out the dryer vent duct, those types of preventive seasonal services, versus reactive corrective. Obviously, that's self-explanatory in that the tenant, maybe the sink's leaking. They put a work order in or call you, hey, sink's leaking, you need to come check it out. That is what it is. But certainly providing some preventive services on an annual basis can go a long way towards saving you money down the road, right? Gutter cleaning is a great example. You keep those gutters clean, water's going to keep flowing, right? You're mitigating your risk for any sort of water getting into the siding, roof, etc., ice damming. So keep the gutters clean. That's just, again, one example of many, but preserving your property proactively is going to save you down the road a lot of money. The part all self-managers hate, making yourself available 24/7, right? You need to be available at 2 in the morning to get that call if the water heater lays a goose egg and there's flooding the basement. So again, just know that if you are a self-manager, you are the point of contact, even in the case of emergencies. Division of responsibility, we reference this a bit in the lease discussion, right? Where just make really clear who's doing what in your lease, so there's no question, all right? Repair replacement approach, right? So, for us, we pride ourselves on, being thoughtful enough with how we address maintenance issues that we know we're doing all we can to mitigate our owner's expense on that property, okay? In the hope of maximizing, of course, their cash flow and return on that investment. And oftentimes that comes down to the question of, are we going to repair this piece of equipment or are we going to replace this piece of equipment? And there's a little bit of gray area in there, right? Because sometimes it's a roll of the dice. Do we want to spend $500 repairing a 15-year-old furnace? Well, you could, and it could last another 5 years, but you also could, and then a week later something else is going to break. Now you got to get a new furnace, and you just said bye-bye to $500 the week prior, right? So there's a little bit, again, of a gamble in that. What's important is that you're responsive to the tenant's needs. You get the issue handled quickly. That's what's going to help drive that positive relationship between you and the tenant. Inspections, we talked about this a little bit earlier. So for us, we try to get inside every property we manage at least twice a year, okay? One of the most important times, if not the most important, is before we offer any type of lease renewal to that tenant, okay? Because we certainly don't want to retain a tenant that's not caring for their property, your property, rather. And so we'll always do an inspection before we go down the lease renewal route. We start our lease renewals about 90 days out from lease expiration, okay? Gives you 3 months to kind of get through the process to understand, A, do we want to renew them? If so, B, do they want to renew, right, at the rate that we've set? And again, gives you some time for some speed bumps along the way, because there may inevitably be some. So again, for us, we're trying to get in at least twice a year. That doesn't mean Eric and I are physically walking inside properties, right? It may be us, could be our leasing agent, could be a maintenance technician. Our entire team knows what to look for when they're in a house, okay? So if our tech is there to replace a faucet, he's doing a bit of a walkthrough, okay? He's looking, are there pets here that don't belong here? Are there too many people living here based on what's on the lease? Now, he doesn't know what's on the lease, right? But we get feedback from him, and we'll know how many people are on the lease. And if you have a bunch of mattresses on the floor, it's a red flag, okay? So again, between all of our team, we're generally in every property at least twice a year. We're doing exterior drive-bys a little more often than that. And again, if we see a problem on the exterior of the property, often, again, that extends to the interior. And so then we're likely going to schedule an inspection shortly after that. Just remember, as a self-manager, you don't want to be super disruptive to your tenant, okay? Roughly every 6 months is probably the threshold that you want to disrupt them and say, hey, I'm going to come walk my house, see how you live, judge you, because that's what they think when they hear that call, right? Like, oh, geez, they want to come and see what I'm doing in here. So just be respectful, obviously, of their space. They have possession of your property. That's why they're paying you rent. Vendor resources. So critically important that beyond just a handyman, that you have some resources for larger issues that may arise, because often those issues arise when time is of the essence, right? In the case of an emergency, for example, a hot water heater goes out, right? You should have somebody that you've made contact with that you feel comfortable contacting for a new hot water heater or a repair in the case of an emergency or otherwise, right? HVAC technician, plumber, electrician. You really need to have these vendors lined up. So if you need to tap one of them, you can, and it's not you then at that point trying to establish the relationship while the clock is ticking. Do that ahead of time, develop those relationships, okay? Questions on property maintenance?
What's your thought on having a home
That's a great question. So we personally hate home warranties. But let me tell you why. There's actually a good reason for that. I personally have had a home warranty and it never served me well. Now, again, that's just anecdotal. But for us as managers, and you probably find the same, where they just inject a super delay into any resolution, right? Because whereas we can get our tech to a place same day,
Yeah, that is a problem.
hey, you got to call my home warranty. Okay, I call somebody in another country. Okay, you're going to then dispatch a vendor who's on your list who's willing to take insurance work, which a lot of vendors aren't, right? So the vendor that's willing to take insurance work will then say, okay, well, I'll put them on my schedule for 5 days from now. Meanwhile, the problem's festering, the tenant's pissed off, and you're just not, again, it goes back to destroying that relationship. I will tell you that insurance, homeowner warranty companies will not spend more than you've paid them in premium. They just won't, right? So they're going to find a way, to mitigate the amount that they're willing to apply to your claim, to the point that in the end, had you just like not had a home warranty and put that money in a reserve fund, you just would have been able to take care of it really quickly. So that's our 2 cents.
Yeah, you'll end up having a
Right.
the response time.
Yeah. They are
Else
painful.
further, because you're so upset.
Yeah. Yeah.
You've mentioned making relationships with the specialists, like for example. How would you recommend we do that? Do you call the companies or like?
Yeah, exactly. So most of those companies are small companies that operate locally. Obviously, there's national companies as well, but really identify those local companies that are a little smaller. Call them and just talk about like their process. Let them know what you're doing, what you want to accomplish, why you're reaching out. And oftentimes, as we've just heard from some managing landlords that we know, like they're super receptive to that, right? They want that relationship with you. That's just more business for them down the road. So it's just as you're trying to build out your vendor list, they're trying to build out their client list. So they welcome those calls. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, anybody in the real estate industry is going to have. Yeah.
I will say a property manager will get you a better deal though. They have 500 houses they're giving that vendor to versus your one. So like price points, you can save.
Yeah, feel free, reach out to us anytime if you guys need a vendor. We're happy to help. So.
In Kansas, I have some of the properties I have a short-term rental as well, and there's one vendor there that won't. Well, I called him and he's like, which property manager you're with, and I was like, no, this is my short-term rental.
All right.
Vendor resources.
They are. It's really important.
Okay.
All right, tenant-landlord relationship. So Dan touched on this. I'll switch you spots so I'm on the camera here. Dan touched on this already. Really important, super important. The tenant is your customer. You got to have that mindset. You want to be responsive to their maintenance needs. You always want to be kind to them, understanding to them. It's going to benefit you in the long run. Let's see. I think those are the key points with that one. I mean, most importantly here, the main reason this is one of your biggest costs, turnover frequency. If you can keep a tenant, keep them happy, you're slowly increasing your rent over time. That is the best case scenario for you. If you're turning your property, it's costing you a lot of money because you got vacancy costs. So that's time that you don't have rent coming in. You got the cost to prepare the property for the next tenant. If you're using a property manager, you got the cost to go find another tenant. It's very expensive to turn a property. So that said, value that relationship with the tenant. It makes things so much easier. I would say for self-managers, get to know your tenant. If you're going to go over there, if you like gardening, tell them you want to come by and you pull weeds or whatever it might be. They'll appreciate it. You'll get to know each other. It really does help out a lot. I guess, are there any questions about?
Don't get too close that when it's something they can't pay rent. Like, oh.
So on that, in fact, we're going to talk about rent collection on that point. And this all boils back to what Dan started with is you do have to run this like a business. At the end of the day, this is a business. So rent collection, you want to be very mechanical about this process. You don't want to deviate from it at all. So first thing that you want to do is make sure that your policy is clearly written out. So whether it be in the lease or it's just an attachment to the lease or something to that effect, you want them to clearly understand rent is due when. For us, it's due on the 1st. Your grace period is how long? For us, it's 5 days. When are late fees being imposed? So in the state of Colorado, you cannot charge a late fee until the 9th of the month. It can be $50 or it can be, I believe it's 5% of the outstanding balance due. In our world, we just charge $50. It stings enough. And for us to try and calculate 5% on everything, it doesn't work. But at any rate, you want something that incentivizes them to pay. That's the whole point of the late fee. So charge that on the 9th of the month. Again, kind of back to Amy's point, you're going to hear excuses. You're going to hear things. You know, I'm a little more lenient. You know, hey, you give me an excuse 1 month, fine. Next month, that's it. We're done. Like, you got to be really tight on that. But you can be right out of the gate. First month, you can be super tight on it. It's a little bit of a judgment call. But I would say once you get past the late fee, you don't want to be too flexible. And the reason being is because now you're into posting a legal demand. So on the 10th of the month, I recommend you post a legal demand. What that is, it's a piece of paper that basically gets taped to their door and it tells them exactly what the situation is. So it's either they owe you rent in this case, or as Dan had mentioned, it could be a lease violation. You're asking about how to enforce it. It can be a violation of the lease. Hey, you need to cure this by this date, or we're moving forward with the legal process. You can do it yourself. There's companies out there that'll do it for like $100. I recommend just do that. They'll go post that demand on the door. Yep. Because technically, per the letter of the law, you need to go up to the door, knock on the door. Are you home? Hand it to them. There's companies that'll do that for you. So if you're not comfortable doing that, just hire a company. It's worth the $100. Honestly, the reality of you getting to this point is pretty rare, but you just need to know it's there and you need to follow this process. Once you get to this point, you have to dot your I's and cross your T's. So post your legal demand. Today, it's a 10-day demand. There are also 30-day demands if something falls into the CARES Act world. So that is typically that's going to be a lot of Section 8 type folks. It's going to be properties that were purchased under federal government programs. You'll want to talk to your attorney about that, or you can give us a call. We can dig into more detail. That'll entail a different type of demand, and it's actually a longer period demand. It's 30 days. So really important you distinguish between that. Post the demand. Let's fast forward now. They have not cured the demand by the demand date. What do you do then? So then you want to engage an attorney because you're going to now move forward with the eviction process. This is a very slow process and it can end at any time, meaning the tenant could walk up to you midway through and give you all the rent and it's done. The legal process stops and you basically go back to the relationship that you had. That's why dotting your I's and crossing your T's is super important, is because that process is so long. From the minute you post a demand to if you got to the point where the sheriff shows up and you're moving their things out, it's about 2 months. So it could take a long time. One little tip, you know, Dan had mentioned setting aside money for maintenance. I would also, you could probably use that fund or set a little extra aside for just vacancy. You know, there could be some time where you go without rent coming in. So you post a demand, they didn't cure by the designated time frame, you give it to your attorney. What's your attorney going to do? He's going to go and he's going to issue them a formal summons. Hey, I want to take you to court because you didn't meet my demand. They are the experts in this. It doesn't cost that much money to have them do it. You don't want to mess this process up. So they're going to reach out to the court. They're going to establish a court date. The tenant, when they get the summons, it'll have the court date on it. This is an opportunity for both parties to meet before the judge and argue their different perspectives. The reality of it is the tenant's not going to show up. That's what happens more often than not, or the tenant will just skip town. So I would say probably 95% of our court cases end in what they call default judgment. It's where the tenant didn't show and the judge automatically defaults to us and say, okay, I side with you guys, you win. The reason why you need to go before a judge is because you need the judge to officially say, yes, that tenant is in violation, and yes, you have the legal right to get them out of your house. You have to do that. You can't, like, you hear these stories, these old school ways of like locking people out, and don't do it. It's not worth it. It'll cost you in the long run. So you get the judge sides with you, you get what's called a writ. That's what you can take to the sheriff. The sheriff will then schedule you to go evict them. There's a whole formula for how many people you need to bring to the property to clear out stuff. What else? That also, scheduling time on that usually about 2 weeks. So, you're really starting to get out there.
What do you do with all that stuff? I've seen this, but you just leave it out on the street.
You leave it out on the street.
But I mean, that's unsightly.
It could be unsightly. In fact, you could get HOA violations. You could get all sorts of stuff can happen. So from that point, once their stuff's there, the minute you have an HOA violation and you got to clear it, then you could do the whole dumpster, all that kind of stuff. But honestly, this all sounds scary. The reality of it is it very rarely gets to that point. The point of this is just follow that process to a T, be very mechanical about it. So you are getting friendly reminders from me, rent's due, where's your rent, blah, blah, blah. But come the 9th, post that late fee. Do not hesitate to post that late fee. And then come the 10th, post that formal demand. Don't miss on that. So, and even if they have a valid excuse, like what we hear a lot of is, I'm getting rental assistance. Well, that process takes a long time too. Still post a demand, get the clock started. We have a funny saying in our office is that the rent collection train just keeps moving. It doesn't stop. Like, you've got to keep it going.
And that's really what's going to test, whether or not you've, eliminated emotion from your management of your property, right? Is your, your ability to post that demand for rent. But again, you have to do it because it'll snowball quick if you don't. If you give a little, the tenants could very well take a lot. So. Yeah.
A lot of protection for them, word of mouth stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
Is there a way to screen, like, for once again,
So you are not allowed to discriminate legally from Section 8. So if somebody is using Section 8 as their income, you can't deny them because of that. What I will say is, in the leasing process, when you're looking for a tenant, you're going to get an entire picture. Yeah. And I would say that if there's somebody that you probably don't want, there's probably other things in their full profile that you could probably deny them on that are you're legally allowed to deny them on. And typically it's credit. A lot of times it's credit. But I'll be honest with you, we've got Section 8 tenants that are just great. And the rent comes in like clockwork.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Yeah. They take really good care of the house. I would say it's a bell curve though. Most of them are average. We've got some really bad ones, and you got some really good ones that have worked themselves off of Section 8 too. Not to get super in depth on that front, but you could do an analysis because there's places around Denver that Section 8 rent is actually more than what you could get for market rent. And the fact that it's guaranteed, it's pretty big. Okay.
So Eric, if
Yeah.
you're a property manager and I have, it needs to be evicted, is that included in your services or is that extra?
Yep. So my time and effort is included in the services. The attorney, though, you have to pay for that fee. So that, for us, we have a negotiated rate. It's like $500 basically to have them evicted, and then there's a fee for the sheriff. It's nominal, like $50 or something like that. Yep.
So who goes to court?
Yep. So we would, if it ultimately went to court, we would go to court. Your property manager would. The first hearing, though, will be the attorney. Yep. But you as the owner would never have to go to court.
And those legal fees are all billed back to the tenant.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point. All that stuff is billed back to the
You
tenant.
may not ever see that money,
Yeah.
but you can bill it back to the tenant legally.
On that note, real quick, any vacancy, so rent that hasn't come in, damages to the house, court costs, all those things can be billed back to the tenant. So keep really good records on that. Likelihood of you collecting on is probably pretty low, but yes, it is. You're legally allowed to go after them for that. And there's good collection companies out there too that'll do that. Cool. Anything else on rent? Financial accounting. All right, so just keep really good records. That's what's most important here. There's two reasons you want to do that. One is to measure the financial performance of your property. And then secondly is you're going to have obligations on the tax side of things. So taxes that need to be paid, filings that need to be made, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, if you're comfortable in Excel, you can do an Excel spreadsheet. There's software packages out there that are really great and they're very inexpensive that do this all for you. I would probably recommend one of those, but keep documents, keep your receipts, you know, be very diligent about it. Also, if you're small, you're probably fine if you're still doing your own taxes. But when you start probably getting, if you're in an LLC, if you got multiple properties, I'd seriously start looking for a CPA. They're worth their weight in gold.
A
So
lot of tax strategy. A lot of tax strategy also.
any questions about counting? Good. Okay. Lease renewal. So as Dan mentioned, we start 90 days out. That's a good number. You could probably even take it up to 60 if you wanted to, if you're self-managing, but about that 60 and 90 day window, that's when you want to start thinking about renewing the lease for your tenant. I'll tell you about our process, and then we can kind of think about how that converts over to a self-manager. So one, our process is a formal inspection of the property. Is the tenant taking care of the property? Secondly, we're reaching out to the owner and saying, do you want to continue to lease your property, or are you considering selling? So what are your intentions? Three, say the owner wants to continue to lease the property. The inspection came back, you know, looks like they're taking great care of the property. You want to look at your tenant, like what has their payment behavior been with you? Do they pay rent timely? Are they, if they're in an HOA, are you getting a ton of HOA violations? Are they a good neighbor? All these things are pretty common sense, especially if you're a self-manager. You're going to know if you want to renew the tenant or not. Part of that process is rent increase. So go out to the best place to go, honestly. We've got tools that we subscribe to, but as a self-manager, if you go out to Zillow and look for comparable properties that are on the current market, that'll give you a pretty good idea of what your property will probably rent for. Most of the time, Zillow will also have an estimate on there. For the most part, it's fairly accurate, but I would still do your own analysis of what's currently on the market, like for like properties. It'll give you a real good idea. So now you know what your property is worth if you were to go out to find a new tenant. Where's your tenant today? So is there a big gap? This is when it's a bit of a judgment call. However, you don't want to take them all the way up to the market rate. It's one, they're going to feel like, hey, what the heck? I've been a great tenant. And they're going to start looking too, is what's going to happen. They're going to go and they're going to go, well, that property is better than this one. I'm moving. And back to turnover costs. They're super expensive. You don't want that turnover. Secondly, you probably have a good relationship with this tenant now, right? So you want to value that. So all that to say, you're probably going to offer them some type of rate that's below market, and that's okay to do. The other factor that you want to bring into this, and it really came into play a couple of years ago when we saw rents really increase, is affordability. Tenants, even though, say, market went up $400 or $500, and hey, I'm going to give them a $200 discount. Well, for a tenant to absorb a $300 rent increase, they just can't. Like, their job didn't go up that much, and you might create yourself an unattended problem, because the tenant's gonna like, I love your property, I want to stay, but they can't afford it. At the end of the day, they can't afford it. So you want to be careful with that as well. So the last piece of this, what I'll say is make your offer to them a formal offer. Put it on a document. It's typed up. Hey, I love you as a tenant. I would like to renew your lease until for another 12 months to this new date. The rental rate that I'm offering you is this, and present it to them as an offer. Either email it to them, mail it to them, whatever it may be. And the reason I say do that is you don't want this to turn into a negotiation. You don't want them to feel like there's some negotiating room. But if you give it to them as a formal offer, in their minds, they're thinking, oh, take it or leave it. And that really cuts down on the back and forth that you'll come into.
If I could just add really quick too, just to emphasize that second point up there, discussing sort of below market rental rates, and it says, of course, within reason. There'll be a point where if your tenant's too far below market, then and they can't afford anymore, then they just should move, right? Because you can, as a landlord, you can only give so much. And although you may not want to take them all the way to market, you certainly want to get them closer, because in the end, you need to maximize that rental rate in order to maximize your return on investment of that particular property. So there's a lot of nuance to that process, right? And the relationship with your tenant drives that process heavily, okay? And so again, if there is a significant sort of disparity in those rates, and Eric and I see this every renewal season where we just have great tenants, they take great care of the property, the owner loves them, they pay rent on time, but they're like $600 below market, right? And so you do the math, you're like, well, okay, they could move out and we'll have turnover cost. But really what we could get for that house, net, we're gonna make more money at the end of this year. So they need to move out, right? So that's an equation you're kind of doing in your mind.
Here, a lot of landlords are actually changing from a 1-year lease to month after they've been there for a year. Is that something that you'd recommend, or do you recommend always doing the annual?
We like annual leases. Again, it's gray. And the reason it's gray is because if you flip to a month, yeah, you're giving yourself the ability to get out, but you're also giving them the ability to get out. So, you get that phone call in November, hey, I'm getting reload for my job. And all of a sudden now you got to go find a tenant, and it's Thanksgiving, it's Christmas. So my preference, honestly, I like the annual leases. And the way I would set them up is I'd set them up to expire probably around April. End of April is a really good time to have them expire. So if you can get them on that cycle, that's a really good cycle to be on.
Yeah, we
If you go to month, it needs to be a lot higher than the rent.
Yeah, because that's a benefit to the tenant to go month to month. So they should pay a bit of a premium. And going month to month might play into your investment strategy to some degree based on what you plan to do with the property. But to Eric's point, having a tenant, if you're going to long hold a property, having a tenant on a traditional lease far better. If you do need to explore some type of month to month or short term lease, at least take into account the fact that you don't want them moving out November, December, January, right? So say, hey, why don't we just do a 3-month lease? If it's October, something like that. Just try hard to avoid those holiday months. Yeah.
And for what it's worth, you can set any time frame you want as well. There's no regulations around that. So if you want to do a 4-month lease, you can do a 4-month lease. Whatever works. But there's definitely seasonality in the rental market, just like the buying and selling market. It follows the same pattern. So your spring months are going to be your best months, and then we're starting, like August will be pretty good, and then September will still be pretty strong, but we're starting to step into the holidays, and kind of from this point on, it's going to get tighter and tighter. And then January, February, it starts to pick back up again, but April, May, June, those are really good times to find new tenants.
All right. Let's talk about the law. So, Amy brought this up earlier in that there has been just a whole bunch of primarily tenant-friendly legislation that's come down the pipe over the past year or two, all sort of rooted initially, obviously, in the CARES Act as a result of COVID, right? The COVID Aid Relief Economic Security Act, which plays a role in different aspects of our business, not the least of which is that rent collection process, right? So you saw on the previous slides where your traditional tenant just paying rent, but maybe had a life event that caused them to be late. You know, if that property is not covered or it has a like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac mortgage, right, then you would just post a 10-day demand traditionally. Okay. If it has a specific type of mortgage or that tenant is already seeking rent relief through a couple of different specific agencies, then you actually are obligated to post a 30-day rent demand. So they have a lot more time to cure that balance. So it's important to know, right, the difference in that, at least for us operating a business. But nonetheless, after sort of the CARES Act, quite a bit of legislation coming down the pipe. We really just captured some of them here is some examples of things to look out for, right, as self-managing landlords. First of all, right, something we're going through right now is the rental license. So if you acquire an investment property in the city and county of Denver, okay, the city and county is going to demand that you have a rental license, right? What that includes is you need to get your house formally inspected by a certified Denver inspector, okay? Make any necessary repairs they might identify, right? That could lead, to a tenant claiming that the house isn't habitable, okay? Nonetheless, you make those repairs. You then need to fill out a lengthy application, pay an application fee, license fee, et cetera. You get to a point where you now have a rental license, okay? Starting this year, January 1st, 2023, all multifamilies had to be licensed. Okay, so for the multifamilies we manage, we went through this process last year to make sure they were in compliance by this last January. And it's a fairly arduous process. This year, we're now going through all of our single family condo townhome rentals because come January 1st, 2024, all of them need to be licensed. Okay, so just know that, right, if you buy a property in the city and county of Denver. Late fees, Eric mentioned this. You can't post until the 7th day after the day rent is technically late, so it falls on the 9th. Eviction protections. So there's something being debated in the House right now called the just cause eviction, right? Where previously you could just give your tenant, say, a non-renewal notice if their lease was coming up for expiration, okay? Well, if that particular legislation passes, right, and the governor ultimately signs it, you'll be very limited in your ability to non-renew a tenant, right? Or how you evict a tenant, right? Whatever the cause may be, you're going to have a lot more obligation on your side as the landlord to meet a higher threshold for non-renewal or eviction. Okay, so we'll see what happens with that. Portable screening report's another one. Right now every property management company charges an application fee. Ours is pretty low, but there's a lot of companies, especially those that manage these large sort of suburban apartment communities. They'll charge you hundreds of dollars to apply for an apartment, right? So now a tenant is allowed, or prospective tenant rather, is allowed to go get pay for an application through an agency, and then they can use that application, as long as it's within 30 days of when that was created, to apply for any property, right? So if a tenant comes to us and says, I've already got this application with all my information on it, you can't charge me an application fee because I've already paid this agency for it. Okay.
And real quick on that, if you guys are posting through Zillow, posting your advertisement through Zillow, a lot of times the applicants can create an application and they can apply for as many properties they want within 30 days. So hopefully it's a non-issue for you all, but there's a chance that you could get somebody who comes in and says, I already have an application. You do have to accept that.
Yep, as long as it's legitimate and created within the last 30 days. Fair housing, right? We've all heard of fair housing. Obviously, no discrimination. That plays a role, I think, in a variety of situations, not the least of which is leasing, right? And how you approve your tenants. But again, look into fair housing, lots of different provisions you need to follow.
And kind of back to your question, Otis, a little bit earlier, just be really careful on fair housing. And I would just use put yourself in their shoes or their lens. And if you're going to deny somebody, really make sure that you're tight on that, because that could create an issue for you.
I mean, if you have multiple people wanting to rent it, I mean, you're obviously going to go for the best one, the strongest one. So
Definitely.
Like, I mean, how is that putting you at risk?
Yep. So make sure that you have that process documented, or you have that documented some way. So if I was you and say you had 3 people who applied for the property and you picked the best one,
Yeah.
I would take those 3 applications and just throw them in your file. That way, if one of those 3 comes back and says, you discriminated against me, you say, nope, I picked the best one. Here are the 3 applications.
Well, and that also is driven by your qualifications, right?
Yes.
So if you're very clear with what it takes to qualify to live at your property, right, then oftentimes the 2 you may not have selected don't meet one of those qualifications, and you're able to deny them, right? For us, running a property management company, we of course have to be very careful with how we approve or not prospective tenants. Okay, so for us, part of that initial screening we talked about in the first slide is understanding, just based on that initial screening, who do we really sense could be the best tenant, right? Based on this, kind of minimal criteria that we've gathered at that point in time, and we'll actually schedule our showings kind of based on that order, in the hopes that the first tenant that sees the house that we feel might have a perceived value as best might then apply for the house. Okay. But again, just want to be really careful with that. For us, we really operate on a first come, first served basis, right? We'll show the house. If you apply and you qualify based on our criteria, then you get to sign a lease, right? So security deposit dispositions. This security deposits, just in general, are, as it says, are the origin of most property management lawsuits. Okay. First of all, you'll collect that security deposit on the front end. You want to place that money in just a separate account and just let it sit there. Okay. That is not your money to spend or to invest or do anything with. It needs to sit in a separate account and just stay there, because technically that's the tenant's money, right? It's a damage deposit. So tenancy ends, right? They move out. You do your move out inspection. You're going to identify all the work that may need to be done in that house to either sell it or find a new tenant. Okay, you're then going to bucket that list of items into either wear and tear, which is your responsibility as a landlord, or damage. Okay, and anything that's classified as damage, you can ultimately use a security deposit to repair those items. Okay, but you want to be really careful about what you classify as damage, because the state might feel otherwise. Okay, for example, certain finishes have useful lives. Okay, so paint, for example, has like a 1-year useful life in the eyes of the state of Colorado. So little nail holes, right, a tenant leaves, you're not gonna be able to charge them to patch and touch those up. Okay, because it's expected that they put nail holes in walls because they want to decorate the home that they're paying to live in. Okay, those types of things. Flooring, carpeting, 7-year lifespan. So you can depreciate carpet over 7 years, right? If they truly damaged the carpet, stains, otherwise, yeah, you can charge them for that. Okay, but you often need to depreciate the amount you charge by the age of the carpet itself. If that carpet's more than 7 years old and it's a rental, you're probably not going to see any money on that carpet, even if they damaged it to a degree. Okay. Point is, the courts really favor tenants when it comes to security deposit lawsuits. So just be really careful with how much money, if any, that you decide to retain from your tenant security deposit when they move out.
And the kicker, I don't know if you guys are familiar with treble damages, but if you're brought to court and the tenant wins, whatever those damages are gets tripled against you. So say what's in dispute is $2,000, you lose, you owe the tenant $6,000. So to Dan's point, the cards are kind of stacked against you. This is an area I'd be very careful in this area. Don't hesitate. Like, damage is damage. If there's a giant hole in the wall or a door's been ripped off, that's damage. But if it's gray, I would kind of lean on the side of err on the side of caution.
Is there a law against putting that in?
There is not. You're able to do that. And in fact, some municipalities require that you do that. Like, for example, if you bought an investment property in Boulder, you have to actually pay interest on a security deposit.
Pay it to
Yep.
the tenant. Yeah, there's a whole formula for it.
Yeah.
I have a question about that actually. When I called banks to like ask about this, they had no idea what I was talking about. I was like,
A lot of
pretty sure I
banks.
could, like get their social security numbers and stuff. So I don't know if I had to do that or not.
Yeah, big thing. You're gonna have to go to big thing. Like first
I mean, I went to
doesn't-
Chase and the guy was like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Was it for a property in Boulder or
No,
what?
well, it's in Boulder County.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you were looking for a specific bank account that would do that?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Because I know New Jersey has stuff like that, so
Yep.
I don't know if Colorado.
So typically in your situation, like if you're still kind of a single landlord, you could just do a savings account and you can go to Boulder County's website and there's an actual formula that you've got a start date and end date and the rate that you multiply it by. It's very minimal.
Yeah, it's not the actual interest necessarily that accrues on the account. It's this formula that Boulder will tell you what you need to pay the tenant, and it's based on like the average of the 10-year yield, something. We don't have any properties in Boulder, so we're not super familiar, but we know that's the case. Really quick too, along those lines, make sure your lease specifies how much time you have to return the tenant's security deposit. Okay, default is 60 days. Okay, so once the tenant moves out, you've got 60 days to get them back whatever they're owed. Okay, our lease, we do 30 days. We just want to process it and get it done. We're moving through our kind of unit turns quick enough that we don't need to wait 60 days. Tenants tend to get antsy after 30 days anyway. They want their money. So we subscribe to a 30-day return policy. But again, much like rent collection, you want to be really mechanical with your security deposit disposition process.
What are the typical holdups on, like as a final inspection kind of going through and figuring out versus wear and tear?
Yeah, so on that end of things, there's not a lot of holdups. The holdups will be, at least for us, just the vendors that we engage to address those items, right? And maybe there was some damage in a property and you've engaged a vendor to go repair it, but you're still waiting for their invoice, right? And you're like, geez, I don't know what to hold back from this tenant because I haven't gotten the invoice yet. So, for us, like we're chasing vendors then to get that information so we can process that security deposit within the 30 days.
Reasonable estimates are okay, but an invoice is better, obviously.
All right. Again, that's the majority of new legislation coming down the pipe. There's more, and there's a lot still being discussed right now. One of the more recent ones, actually, that's not on there that we just learned about a couple of days ago is radon testing. So now, and this is a Colorado-wide law that as a landlord, your tenant has the right to get your house tested for radon or demand that you do. If it registers more than 4, right, on the radon scale, as a landlord, you are obligated to get a radon mitigation system installed if it's a rental property, okay? And that was just signed at the end of June. There's a bit of a delay when that goes into effect. But nonetheless, that's like right now in our face. And so we're having to update our lease accordingly because there's a whole disclaimer that you need to have in your lease about radon now. All right. So again, just one of the news. Yeah, it applies to brokers too. That's right. All right. So again, we've touched on some of these things. Reasons why you may decide one day that professional management is right for you. We feel we can justify why it actually saves you money. One, we have a process to reduce vacancy loss, right, through our leasing process, tenant acquisition process, and even a little bit of mitigation of that revenue lost due to vacancy could pay for an entire year of professional management, right, potentially. When you hire a professional manager, you're more likely to avoid costly mistakes, right? They have processes. They know how to properly manage properties, et cetera. Amy mentioned it earlier with volume pricing, right? So when we're getting work done at our properties, we have vendor relationships. We're able to get obviously advantageous pricing for items. And then, professional management fees are tax deductible. So being a finance guy himself, that gets Eric's excited.
But you